We are ready to reconvene for our second panel, and I'm very excited to be moderating this panel on the haptics of race. This is a really amazing lineup of people, each of whom have articulated a very extremely challenging and innovative approach to theorizing the hapticity of racial formation in different domains, registers, and practices. In organizing the panel, my hope was that we would be able to stage something akin to what Christina Sharp describes as thinking juxtapositionally, juxtaposing the respective approaches of each of our guests to thinking through the haptics of race offers us a challenging opportunity to understand how the haptic provides a generative framework for critical engagement, practice, and thought. So I'm going to introduce everybody alphabetically and so that I don't have to interrupt any of the presentations. Our first panelist speaker is Rizvana Bradley. She's an assistant professor of film and media studies and African American studies at Yale University, and she is currently finishing the year as a visiting research fellow in the History of Art department at the University College London. She holds a BA from Williams College and a PhD from Duke University, and she was previously a Helena Rubinstein Critical Studies Fellow at the Whitney Museum of American Art. Ashon Crawley is Assistant Professor of Ethnic Studies at UC Riverside. His research and teaching experiences are in the areas of Black studies, performance theory and sound studies, philosophy and theology, Black feminist and queer theories. He, too, is a Duke University graduate. And his first book project, Black Pentecostal Breath, The Aesthetics of Possibility, is an investigation of aesthetics and performance as modes of collective social imaginings otherwise. Samantha Shepard is Assistant Professor of Cinema and Media Studies in the Department of Performing and Media Arts at Cornell University, where she is currently a faculty fellow at the Society for the Humanities, where she's completing her manuscript, Sporting Blackness, Race, Embodiment, and Critical Muscle Memory in Sports Cinema. She earned her MA and PhD in Cinema and Media Studies from the University of California, Los Angeles. Sheppard is the co-editor of From Medea to Media Mogul, Theorizing Tyler Perry. And finally, Mila Zuo is Assistant Professor of Film at Oregon State University. She, too, is a UCLA graduate. So we've got two UCLA, two Duke. All right. Her current book project examines the effective work and world-making of contemporary Chinese women film stars. Zuo's creative praxis examines the embodied performances of race and gender through narrative filmmaking. Her short film, Carnal Orient, was an official selection in a dozen international film festivals and is exhibited in theaters and gallery spaces in Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, San Diego, Atlanta, Portland, London, Singapore, Nagoya, and the Czech Republic, as well as in various university classrooms. Please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Rizvana Bradley.
Thank you, Rizvana. That was great. And I'm very excited to be here. Thank you, Tina, for the invitation. And I'm a little bit jet-lagged and stuff, but it's all good. So The Lonely Letters is the title of this new project that I've been working on since 2010, when I thought I fell in love with this boy, who I no longer am in love with, but I began to write myself emails instead of him because the few emails that I did send, he did not respond to. And so a friend was like, you should write to yourself instead of to him because you can get it out there, but you don't have to like badger him. And somewhere around like the third email that I sent to myself, I figured out I wasn't really talking about him and really was sort of just trying to think about love and desire. And so this was written sort of alongside the dissertation and alongside the book, and 4 of the fictional letters are actually in the book, Black Pentecostal Breath. And I'm developing out this, what I call an autobio-fictional project that thinks about sound and noise of Black Pentecostal spaces, and it also thinks about mysticism and the musical and joy and love and heartbreak. So I'm going to read some of the letters from the Lonely Letters. 3 epigraphs. 1, some tale or trace of her voice is yet to be bodiless thrust, caught in his throat like a sand, a precise powder perhaps, as of a moth's or even an angel's wings, cautioning breath itself. Number 2, somewhere a curtain had fallen away, a cape of moth-eaten silk. And number 3, he'd been nervous for days, weeks, months. It thus came as no surprise that during the drive to Burbank, there had been moths, not butterflies, in his stomach, and that his stomach might as well have been wool. And all 3 of those are from Nathaniel Mackey's From a Broken Bottle, Traces of Perfume Still Emanate. And the prologue is, between here and there, between then and now, is a world, our worlds of trouble. Dear Moth, what if it were possible to vibrate at the same speed and velocity as our favorite music, our favorite sound? What if we resonated the way Mahalia Jackson sort of wails and sways on Soul and How I Got Over, or like a Twinkie Clark Black Pentecostal shout on the Hammond B3 organ?
How I got over. How did I make it over? You know my soul look back and wonder, how did I make it over?
And
you make somebody hurt yourself. Don't you touch that organ no more. Don't touch it. Don't hit that note that I like. I'll dance. Don't Twinkie, you know that note I like. Don't you hit that note. Get off the organ. Please don't hit that note, Twinkie. Y'all want her to hit that note? They want you to hit that note, Twinkie. They want you to hit that note, Twinkie. And we gonna dance. We gonna
what if we could just move and tremble and quiver and quake and spin and spin and spin until equilibrium is off and we slip into the sonic world? I watch The Flash a lot, even though I have to catch up on the episodes, but the show keeps intimating that if Barry could just vibrate at the same speed as what is presumed to be solid, impenetrable matter, they keep saying that he could slip into and through the matter itself. So what if we could do the same with music and with sound? Would we perhaps then evaporate into and be united with it? What would then be our mode of existence? What song or sound would you choose? I'd want to choose something that resonates with a simultaneity, spin and quiver and quake and be one with you, withdraw into you and you withdraw into me. So yeah, what's the song? Moving, A. Dear Moth, here's a quote from this great essay about Ralph Ellison, Albert Einstein, and George Jackson. Quote, I was lonely and found these 3 lonely men. Oh, Ellison, to paraphrase myself, I love you. Write me, I'm lonely. Dearest Einstein, his lonely ways. And Jackson, alone in the most hostile jungle on earth. The fundamental condition of writing, of study, is enforced solitude, loneliness. I've been thinking of Michael Cobb, who writes of the queerness of loneliness, of being alone. And through him, I think the queerness of this binding, these men bound together by me, is queer in me, through me. And here too, all the women who are communing with each other and with these men as ghosts and at the same time materially real and so far from one another. Lonely we have come together to study, to write to each other, end quote. I'm into this, writing and study about loneliness and aloneness, but I guess I'm also bothered by it. It is perhaps why I've been writing you letters, why I have been reading letters too, like Ta-Nehisi Coates to his son, James Baldwin to his nephew, Seeley to God and to Nettie, N to Angel of Dust, M nor Bessie Phillip to the dead who are yet with us. And I have been thinking about a theory of the letter and how it's to search for what N calls a broken claim to connection, where what is sought after and what is desired is relationship. What is sought after and what is desired is that which exceeds the broken claim for and in the service of connection. And I guess I've been thinking about blackness and mysticism because there's something about the practice of noise making that Black Pentecostals perform that is so mystical to me, that announces a fundamental and deep and moving and abiding connection with one another and the creaturely world. In such a world, nothing is inanimate, everything moves and vibrates. But mysticism seems to be so much about renunciation of the flesh, of the social, before the possibility of discovery of the divine, of the intangible but perhaps felt world. One has to leave the flesh, one has to leave the social as a first move in order to hear more precisely, to feel more properly, before re-entry into the social in this sort of mystical tradition. We keep thinking that mystics talk about leaving the noise of the world to hear more clearly, but what would that noise have been in the medieval period, for example? Certainly not the same noise as one hears on the streets of New York City. I've been reading lots of Cedric Robinson and have been moved to tears reading him because what he establishes is connection by reorientation to direction, by just giving up on linearity, though he goes through linear history to show its ruse and its uselessness for thinking about the Black radical tradition. So I'm not picking on Meister Eckhart or Teresa of Avila or St. John of the Cross. Robinson and the way he talks about the limits of Marxism helps me think about radicalism internal to mysticism, even of European traditions, but also the delimitation that they cannot get beyond, though they move in the path of such an approach. For an example, Meister Eckhart believed in the differentiation between the divine and creaturely worlds, that there is a fundamental separation that can perhaps be bridged. There is a difference immeasurable for the divine and the creaturely for him, but this immeasurable difference emerges from a way to think worlds that presumes difference that is categorical, that difference could be maintained. So with Western mysticism, perhaps like what we find in Black Marxism, is the beginning of racial thought and racial categorization, all right there in European mystical thinking. This immeasurable distance as being possible, as being possibly maintained and thus pure and categorical, would come to mark the racialization to come, proceeds and functions alongside racialization internal to European thought. And so maybe marronage is a mysticism to which we can attend. Maybe I'm after a way to think about a mysticism that is about the renunciation of the singular, the renouncing of being individual, the retreat into the social away from the subject. And it's because I've seen the movie Moonlight and have been thinking a lot about intimacy and the failure of Western epistemologies to capture excess. This, of course, is the gift of excess. So, did I tell you about the dude that I went to undergrad with that was this year flirty as hell with me, but also straight identified? So wouldn't own his affections or desires, but he kept projecting everything onto me? The one that I gave a copy of The Price of the Ticket to. He said he'd been a fan of Baldwin, and I was feeling nice that day and bought him a copy and mailed it to him. He read a part of it, and after he'd read some of it, called me on the phone, and we've never talked on the phone in our lives, just to talk about the book and other things. And he told me he couldn't stop thinking about this one essay, Here Be Dragons, how he kept talking about it to everyone he was encountering. So of course I wanted to talk about it with him. He's the one that after talking to him that one time for about 45 minutes late at night, a week later I sent him a message joking with him that he disappeared after our first convo, and he replied that he was, quote, running out of politeness with me. The one that after that comment I haven't spoken to since I refuse to be disrespected because he can't deal with his emotions and his desires. Well, I woke up thinking about him because, I don't know, that shit hurt my feelings. And I think about it every now and then. I liked him, sure, but I wasn't making things up. I know it was reciprocal and likely overwhelming for him, but I was never, ever too intense or even too flirty. I guess it was my writing in the book something like, to my new friend, and closing with XOXO, but why are straight identified men so afraid of the shit they start but don't have the will to finish? Then it hit me after watching Moonlight. It was the intimacy that bothered him. What's been so astonishing to me about intimacy and about the way people talk about Moonlight as emasculating Black men, and that intimacies between Black men are causes for lament and terror and should be shunned, is this thing. Intimacy means that connection is possible, that sexuality isn't something that can be explained away with biogenic conceptualizations of the human, of evolutionary development. Intimacy means that there is something ephemeral that is sought after and desired that cannot be put into charts and metrics, that cannot be measurable in some sort of scientific way. And this, it seems, is a problem, specifically in a world that presumes that science can answer all, a world predicated upon disciplinary knowledge, predicated upon the coloniality of being, power, truth, and freedom. That is, we exist in a world that much rather have a scientific explanation for sexuality, but intimacy is such that it resists such easy analytics. And this, intimacy, is a gift. It is the gift of resistance. It is the gift of being resistant to being incorporable into Western knowledge regimes. I enjoyed talking to him because I'd been feeling lonely and alone. And I've been exploring mysticism because I don't want to be lonely, and I'm intrigued by the call and almost forced inhabitation of loneliness. But this sounds too much like it's about me. It's about connection. I write a lot about possibility because I've been so disappointed in the world, in both big world historical ways, but mostly on the level of the personal. How much is one supposed to endure is something I think about a lot. So thanks for the kind words. It isn't easy talking about the things that I write about because they emerge from such disappointment. Everything said, everything written in search of connection. But admittedly, I'm still learning. A. Dear Moth, there are worlds, and the fact of our experiencing them is because we are impossibly vulnerable, open as a way of life. The central nervous system isn't enclosed in the borders of the so-called body, but it's out there in worlds. That which is central is a kind of ecstatic force, ecstatic being, existence beside or otherwise than the self, such that the idea of an outside and inside needs to be rethought, maybe entangled, maybe a system. It's been a while since I've heard from you. You sent the text when you returned home that you shouldn't have come over, that you're sorry that you cried, that you love me but you can't. And then all this talk about God, and mostly about God. You wrote to me about God, and I had to think about it, and had to think about what God is. What quantum physics is discovering is a redefinition of space-time as not linear nor separable. If this is the case, and as you say, God is the unfolding of all that is and is not detectual by sensual capacities, then that would mean that there is something behind or that withdraws from even this quantum understanding of space-time, some otherwise sort of relation, some sort of unity and convergence that would also undo the concepts of unity, convergence, together, sociality, unfolding. Does this make any sense? No, it's in the letter. But thank you, I appreciate that. I'm sorry, A appreciates it, A. And then to love, because don't we think of love as the unfolding of possibility in time and space, or following quantum mechanics in space-time, that approaches a kind of sociality of experience? But then maybe also love would be that which necessarily withdraws through approach the very possibility of possibility. Because what does it mean for something or nothing to be of, from, or marking a relation to possibility if it recedes from sense experience? Love as the sense experience beyond sensuality, beyond or withdrawing from sense experience. It's like when you said you are more than someone else's negation, someone else's exclusion. Because we exist in and as excess, as that which cannot be contained or engulfed or enclosed by anything, negation and exclusion included. It's as if we are the flesh of what quantum mechanics is discovering. What I'm trying to say, imprecisely, is this: I think I love you. I watch an oversimplification of her beauty, as you know, a lot. And I get why she sent the text she did, why it was a question that was also a statement, how it was tentative but also very sure. I think I love you. I finally understand because you, Moth, make me feel what I've been afraid to say, but I always knew to be true. I have never felt this way about anyone in my life before, and that sounds like a platitude, but what I mean is this. You are, and my feeling for you is black noise, is static, is sort of the background against which everything I do occurs. I don't consciously think about you all of the time, no, but I feel you. When I sleep, when I wake, when I cook, when I sing, as I breathe, as I breathe, as I breathe, it's you. A sort of quiet omnipresence, a soft enclosement. You are the sound, almost chant-like, I hear sort of far off in the deep recesses and furthest reaches of my flesh. And yet you feel more than near, closer than anything I've ever known. I do not think about you as much as I think you. It's as if you are bound to each thought, whatever that thought might be, I think. It's as if you are the ground of all that is for me. I don't mean this in a way that is pathological, or that I cannot exist without you, or that I have some weird codependency that is more about my ego and narcissism than it is about your well-being. I mean that I desire you, and I feel that we are one. I understand David and Jonathan being knit together, quote, unlike weaving, knitting does not require a loom or a large equipment, making it a valuable technique for nomadic and non-agrarian peoples, end quote. They were knit together and were movers and nomadic. Nomads are wanderers, and I'm thinking about David's psalm, talking about walking through the valley of the shadow of death but not fearing, wandering in death's shadow but still feeling assured. And though this 23rd Psalm is about the Lord, I also wonder if it's about what had been backgrounded, David's being knotted up and tangled with Jonathan. What I mean is this: I love you, no question mark. And what I mean is this: I have not stopped telling everyone about you, the joy you have and continue to bring me. And what I mean is this: there is not only you in the world, but you are my paraclete, or I yours. And what I mean is this: I want a consensuality with you, a continued consent to be together. And what I mean is this: entanglement might be the best way to approach what I feel, that once bound together, we are a system. We maintain our uniqueness regardless of the nearness or farness, regardless of space-time separation. We are indivisible. We are not separable in any easy way. We renounce the individual for the social, for and with and in each other. And what I mean is this: it's as if dream worlds were hallucinating otherwise universes as possible, and mine and your dream worlds outpoured toward each other, enfolded into and collapsed within each other. And what I mean is this: it's kind of beautiful and mostly scary, because I don't know what this means and haven't since I first met you, and I'm unsure what to do. I do not want to control you. Your consent is more necessary than my desire. And what I mean is this, finally: I don't want you to go to seminary if it means you will not and cannot be with me. I want to support you, but why the priesthood when they require celibacy? My stomach churns at the thought of us not being together. I literally get sick at the thought. Your t-shirt that you left here when you were last here, I have not yet washed because the smell of sweat and polo cologne and you and you and you linger on in it. Don't do this, please. I hate to even ask such a thing. Don't not go for me, but please don't go. I know Saint Sabina was formative for you, that you chose that space of care and were compelled so much that you were able to convince your parents to join the church too. I know you want to continue in the tradition of the folks there, that you think the University of St. Mary of the Lake is the place to which you are called to study for a master's degree. But please, do you think this will make you happy? Can you do the justice work and the preaching in another tradition? I need you too. Until the space-time beyond when where I no longer feel you, which will never be a. Two more. Dear Moth, I was driving and my random shuffle played Steve Reich's Music for 18 Musicians, Movement 11, and it was the first time I'd heard it in a long time, and it was so moving, the bass notes, that which gave it a sort of grounding, that I listened to the entire album as if for the first time. And I've got to say, playing the entire thing and arriving at Movement 11 made me tear up in the car. That's the transition. The entire album is about movement, about incremental change and difference, so you end up wondering how you got from the beginning to the end of the 1 hour and 8 minute album. Between here and there, between now and then, was a world, were worlds of sonic possibility. It could have been otherwise. It's as if I slipped into a crack the size of a neutrino, but as I kept falling in, I experienced the expanse of the mysterious beyond of space-time, a beyond that is not predicated upon, but fundamentally an alternative to Newtonian physics and the conceptual linearity for time. I felt finally prepared to hear what was in Steve Reich, because I finally had been thinking and talking and really feeling Black Pentecostal music so much more. even when it doesn't emerge from Black Pentecostal churches, like Mount Dewell Baptist Church and their singing of He Set Me Free.
Be free. Yes, sir. Well, he set me. What else? Jesus died on the cross. Set me free. Yeah. All right.
It's like what Mackey says about dreams, how one doesn't know how one moves from one scene to another scene, one just ends up in the middle of them. That's how it feels listening to Reich, or yes, to Mount Dewell. But it's also mysticism, a Black mysticism, a mysticism that requires the renunciation of the one in the favor of becoming plural, or not really becoming, but acknowledging the plurality that is the grounds of our existence. Music, Steve Reich announces, is for 18 musicians. The singing at Mount Dewell is a collective improvisational practice. They retreat into rather than away from the social. Maybe I'm just making it up, but it seems like a refusal to be alone, such that the categorical distinction between alone and loneliness evaporates away. Moving on, A, and then the last one. Dear Moth, the occasion of the political climate, the occasion of the old but for many, new thing about politics and disorganization gave me a really explicit example. This is what I meant by renouncing the one for the many. These are folks that own and work at bodegas in New York City. All kinds of folks gathered together in order to argue in favor of their flesh for the protection of their collective improvisational, non-divisional, non-singular identity. They moved and worked in the favor and protection of a non-liberal subjectivity, an intersubjective, otherwise as possible. Look at the sort of gracefulness with which they stand and then bow and then bend. Listen to the quiet that makes the sound of wind and street noise apparent, a quiet that is not about the evacuation of sound, but a refilling and indwelling of otherwise sound. Listen to how in that silence is the anticipation for the sounding out and call to pray. I don't know, it's beautiful to me. They withdrew into the world, into worlds, made themselves available and open by retreating into the outside. There in the outside, they found through performance the secret place of the most lowliness, the secret place of Blackness, or to echo a friend, lowly against exaltation. They withdrew into the clearing, and there they worshiped, and there other days stood and watched, rapt. They ascended into descent. They left bodegas and made themselves secret in public, and in such doing undid the distinction between private and public. They made apparent otherwise in the flesh, in the then, now, soon, and whenwhere of space-time. Entanglement, entangled. They were not lonely. It is a mysticism of the social, the mysticism of sociality. I've been listening to my breathing more as I sleep, or not really listening, but have become more aware of it as a sound, as making noise, as displacement continually. I listen as I sleep or as I run on the treadmill, or even as I walk down the street. Something about the constant movement of air in and out, something about how we have to keep doing it in order to keep alive, how it is a biogenic fact, how flesh needs air to revive itself, sustain itself constantly. That something from the so-called outside's got to come in and dwell in us, and maybe descent and descent of the Holy Ghost was just making this explicit. What keeps us alive and what holds us in embrace of the living is the something that is available and common and collective and social and outside of oneself. It is the ecstasy in the most explicit sense. And I get this feeling as I watch these people pray in the middle of the city, as I watch them pray as staging protest. They're praying from positions physically and from stations of life, sort of theologically and philosophically, that are considered, at least in the United States, to be discardable and unnecessary and in need of conversion. But what they're praying in the sort of secret place of blackness shows me is that they breathe, and in the fact of such breathing, we should cherish it. I'll say more soon, but this is getting to be too long. A. In post-log, between then and there, between now and then, were worlds, our worlds of trouble. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashon, and thank you, Tina, and thank you, Nancy. My voice is a little bit of a struggle, but we're gonna work it out. In Citizen, an American lyric, poet Claudia Rankine examines Serena Williams' embodied experiences on the tennis court, particularly the racially inflected, curious calls and oversights Williams faced during the US Open in 2004 and 2009. Calling attention to both Williams' phenomenal and phenomenological black sporting performance in the historically white space of professional tennis, Rankine affirms that, yes, quote, the body has memory. The physical carriage hauls more than its weight. The body is the threshold across which each objectionable call passes into consciousness. All the unintimidated, unblinking, and unflappable resilience does not erase the moments lived through, even as we are eternally stupid or everlastingly optimistic, so ready to be inside, among, a part of the games. As Rankine describes, the black sporting body has memory, or more aptly, if not athletically speaking, I'd like to argue that the black sporting body has muscle memory, and that muscle memory can and should be read in critical ways in order to understand the significance of movement in visual as well as haptic dimensions. Muscle memory is a term that comes out of human kinetics, which characterizes the inherent and tactile property of muscles. It is a process by which motor skills are remembered in the brain and enacted through the body. A form of motor learning, muscle memory is procedural, meaning it consolidates and encodes specific tasks into embodied memory through the repetition of physical action and long-lasting changes in muscle tissue. It is not just physiological, but also cognitive, where motor and brain systems work in tandem to engender kinesthetic intelligence as embodied virtuosity. For athletes, this combined physical and mental practice disciplines the body and helps them to actively reproduce past movements without seemingly conscious effort, allowing for efficiency, recall, endurance, and improvisation. C.L.R. James, for example, theorized muscle memory to describe cricket as a dramatic spectacle and visual art, one that is proprioceptive and multisensorial, where, in the case of cricket, a batsman's bodily movements and, quote, the articulation of his limbs are visible, but what, quote, is not visible is received in the tactile consciousness of thousands who have themselves practiced the same motion and know each muscle that is involved in each stroke. By examining blackness in motion or contest, or to repurpose Rankine's words, blackness that is so ready to be inside, among, a part of the games, I want to consider more specifically how the black sporting body has what I call critical muscle memory. The term critical muscle memory mobilizes the metaphor of kinesthetic movement as an analytical tool and an intervention into critical discourses, including genres, histories, and representational politics of black sporting bodies on screen, by calling attention to and engaging with critical race theories on black memory and corporality in and beyond sporting worlds. Using conceptual artist Hank Willis Thomas's 2000 video Overtime, I want us to think through how proprioception, as Brian Masumi has argued, translates the exertions and ease of the body's encounters with objects into a muscular memory of relationality. And in doing so, proprioception helps us to frame kinesis or athletic play as a site of the critical in muscle memory's gesture towards and articulation of related black embodied experiences. Critical muscle memory, then, allows me to account for the histories that are represented in and those that exceed over time's diegesis, engaging, as Rankine described earlier, the moments lived through, meaning the social issues, conditions, and changes specific to Black lived experiences. Hank Willis Thomas, whose mediums include photography, sculpture, mixed media installation, and video art, explores the perception of African Americans in popular culture, often in the realm of athletics and advertisements. His work on race and sports foregrounds themes of commodification, consumption, mass production, exploitation, and commerce. Thomas's work mobilizes Blackness as a cultural signifier, one that is contingent on the specifics of its historical, social, and cultural production, and yet open to multiple and competing claims. His work, like the other work that I look at, challenge what it means to sport Blackness in an embodied and theoretical sense, and suggest that Black sporting bodies can be read for more than their visible appeal. In this sense, and through sensation, Black sporting bodies can also be read for their tactile values, which can stimulate the tactile consciousness of the viewer. They can also be read for their sense of movement, which can highlight a heightened sense of capacity in both the image and the spectator, as well as for their resonant histories, which can show, as Harvey Young has suggested, that there is, quote, a remarkable similarity, a repetition with a difference that exists among Black experiences. Blackness here in Thomas's images is less a stable racial category and more a theoretical motor, a moving and contested discourse and performance by Black subjects. Thomas turns Black sporting bodies into what Stuart Hall calls canvases of representation, whereby the Black body is a creative and mutable corpus, a text made of text, able to mean and mean again on screen. As such, I'd like to turn our attention to Thomas's 5-minute video Overtime, a film that privileges what Michelle Ann Stevens' reading of C.L.R. James describes as a, quote, haptic visuality, meaning a body line engaged in the perfect flow of motion, where the gaze is supported by the other senses and by sensory movement. In producing a haptic visuality grounded in proprioception, Overtime choreographs a history of the Black embodied experience, where athletic movement, particularly the hang time of basketballers, is reticulated with aesthetic, political, and racial connotations via the replacement of the hoop with a hangman's noose, casting the athletes who play on screen into larger arenas of meaning where they move alongside bodies bearing related histories. With that said, let's turn our attention to the screen as we watch Overtime in its complete manifestation. At 5 minutes in length, Thomas's Overtime evinces the ways in which I like to think about sporting blackness and embodied histories as proprioceptive, translating the exertion, the sight, the sound, the sweat of the basketballers on screen encounters with the noose into a muscular memory of relationality, a story of the black body as spectacle. Overtime portrays the black sporting body as both a current event and an historical situation, choreographing history as Susan Foster describes by, quote, granting that history is made by bodies, and then acknowledging that all bodies, in moving and documenting their movements and learning about past movement, continually conspired together and are conspired against. Going even further, Foster explains that, quote, in the process of committing their actions to history, these past and present bodies transmit to a mutually constructed semiosis. Together, they configure a tradition of codes and conventions of bodily signification that allows bodies to represent and communicate with other bodies. Thomas's Overtime sutures and reveals structuring absences about the spectacles of black entertainment for visual consumption by staging historical crises of racial violence within the arena of the athletic spectacle, showing, as sports scholar Ben Carrington suggests, how sports are an important and overlooked arena for the making and remaking of race beyond its own boundaries. As you saw, Overtime uses slow motion and dissolves to position and remove the body within the film's tightly cropped frame, making the history of lynching a presence and an absence, a spectacle and a specter. Thomas repeatedly stages scenes that question, and this is his question, what happens when the visual legacy of American lynching collides with the visual legacy of the slam dunk? A temporal, historical, and ontological disjunction, the film's ontological temporality shows how past and present coexist in the same space. As the title of the piece signals, overtime is the extra additional hours beyond a person's work schedule, as well as the additional time added to a game that's resulted in a tie. It speaks overwhelmingly to the notion of laboring black bodies on and off the court, underscored not only in the film's representation of athletic movement, but also in the soundscape. Oral percussionist Dito shaped the music of Overtime, using a blend of voice and breath to attach the ideas of struggle, labor, and violence to the physical and metaphysical sporting activities on screen. While some black bodies dunk through the noose, others hang from the rope, dangling within the frame like the lyrics from Strange Fruit, most specifically the lines, black bodies swinging in southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Black male sporting prowess is constructed as something to be revered and feared, where the noose, the ball, and the body are picked up as icons of history that are colored with commercial and cultural reference. Overtime's digital effects conjure history through a focus on the poetics of the black sporting body's movement and, to play off Fanon, the muscle tension and their relationship to these items and emblems. Thomas's film provocatively reminds us that sports are about the spectacle of black laboring bodies historically, calling us to think about embodied histories of that labor. In doing so, Overtime depicts the black body as a repository of critical muscle memory, one that plays out and plays with history, reframing and recollecting the visual legacies of black embodied experiences. To call back to Rankine's opening affirmation that, yes, the body has memory and that the physical carriage hauls more than its weight, I want to conclude by considering that critical muscle memory, or the haul in Overtime, as a means to get to a more haptic dimensionality. The film carries and casts individual and groups of black sporting bodies into a shared discursive space of being and becoming, of appearing and disappearing and reappearing and disappearing, where black experiences are played and replayed. Overtime shows us that the moving black body attaches itself to various histories through its embodied performance, calling us as spectators to see the historical connections, the bodily joints, as representative of conjoined histories that connect us as viewers to the images on screen. Whether witnesses or participants, the critical muscle memory evoked in overtime calls into focus sporting performance and how history is played out and contested over time in, by, and through representations of the Black sporting body. Thank you.
Before I begin, I just want to say I'm so honored and humbled to share the stage with my co-panelists, and thank you so much to Tina and Nancy for inviting me. Okay, so the prequel film to Silence of the Lambs, Hannibal Rising, finally explains the gustatory origins of Hollywood's most mythologized cannibal. Born of good breeding and taste to wealthy Lithuanian aristocrats, as a child, Hannibal Lecter witnesses his parents' murders and cannibalism of his infant sister by Nazi collaborators. Years after the war, Hannibal flees to France to live with his widowed aunt, Lady Murasaki, played by Chinese film star Gong Li. Murasaki trains him in Japanese samurai swordplay, and as femme fatale, she also inspires his first kill, a French Vichy butcher who loudly asks Murasaki in a market if her, quote, pussy runs crossways, repeating an Orientalist anatomical myth that performs excessive pleasure encoded in disgust. Murasaki's alleged deviant genitalia is visually analogized through slit-open pig carcasses and chunks of animal flesh hanging in market stalls. A literal meat shot, a term that Linda Williams uses to refer to genital penetration in hardcore pornography, takes the place of the obscene, that which could only be off-scene in a non-pornographic film. However, this graphic suggestion generates a surplus of meaning that exceeds language and is in part made sense through the odoriferous mise-en-scène of fragrant pre-cooked foods. As phenomenological film scholars like Vivian Sobchak and Laura Marks have demonstrated, cinematic spectatorship is premised on cross-sensory, cross-modal synesthesia. That is, we imaginatively taste, touch, and smell through our audiovisual engagements with film, consuming cinema through mimetic activation of our senses. Referring to an olfactory imagination, Sobchak suggests that smell occurs through affective mediation of tonal elements that subjectively modulate and qualify the people we see on screen. I would also add that smell becomes entangled with film's tonal elements and projected onto bodies, inflecting our perceptions of them. So Murasaki's dehumanization then is conveyed and reinforced not only by language and by spectacular juxtaposition of animal carcasses with her body, but also through an affective feeling tone conveyed by synesthetic significations of sour, bloodied meat. These qualify her image as something that is at once not yet consumable, that is raw and pre-cooked, and already putrescent, decaying flesh. Murasaki's body is thus rendered into a paradoxical object of suspicion, and her racialized alterity is sensualized through sensorial intimations of the inassimilable, indigestible, and the non-human. Unsurprisingly, the film narrative reproduces the epistemological favoritism of vision and hearing as the higher rational senses of Eurocentric civilization. Meanwhile, overdrawn smell and taste perceptions correspond with characters' lower moral character and psychotic perversions. And as desirous object, Murasaki's primitive sexual appeal is metaphorized through her extraordinary bodily aroma, as commented by Hannibal's nemesis, who says, quote, "The scent of her took away the smell of the camp." As radical other, Murasaki's sensual Japaneseness masks their traumatic sense memory of Holocaust camps, eliciting an odorphilia that promises to ameliorate Western trauma and allow its male victims, and by extension, its spectators, to forget their historical troubles, or at least this is the claim. They are the transgressive desiring subjects that Bell Hooks describes of white progressives who seek transformation through seductive encounters with the other. Nevertheless, stopping short of eating the other, which would have been perfectly reasonable here, Hannibal Rising's insatiable men, if I can get this to play, instead ingest her in other ocular and oral pleasures. So, hoping to use Hannibal Rising as an appetizer to my talk today, I'll look into Gong Li as a transnational case study through which to compare the sensuous spectatorship of the Chinese female body in Western and Chinese cinemas, taking up Hook's provocation that, quote, ethnicity becomes spice, seasoning that can liven up the dull dish that is mainstream white culture, end quote. In my manuscript in progress, I examine particular flavors that become sensually attached to Chinese women film stars. These women embody the contradictions of what has been referred to as globalization's odorless processes and the changing tastes of modern Chineseness. Inspired by Judith Farquhar's discussions of the Chinese medical body as a flavorful temporal formation, as well as by Chinese aesthetic and vernacular conceptions of flavor as quality, I propose flavor as an analytic through which we might approach the non-representational or affective qualities of cinema in conjunction with the ways in which sociocultural tastes are cooked into representation, becoming inextricable from and absorbed into the ways we experience on-screen figures. Kyla Tompkins' observation that the visual pleasure in black pain suggests a desire to taste it also holds true, I believe, for Asian and female bodies. Focusing on tasting as a spectatorial process rather than taste as Bourdieuian object capital, I inquire about the lingering intimacies and parasensualities of tasting Chinese bodies. In pursuit of a transnational understanding of embodied flavor, I examine now how the indigestible flavor of bitterness becomes cathected to Gong's body through mediation of national affects and world-making in her early films. Director Zhang Yimou has said that he selected then-unknown Gong for her first feature film debut, Red Sorghum, because of her po la, or her spicy temper, and also her wei dao, which means flavor in general. The Chinese term wei dao is a commonly used polysemous phrase comprised of the words wei, which means taste, smell, and dao, which means path or road. The combination of words implicitly suggests a methodology through what we would call the lower sensorium. Wei dao is most commonly used to describe food, but can also be used to qualify an atmosphere, place, or person, referring to a distinctly attractive style. Eluding a concrete or fixed definition, wei dao denotes a fluid process and gestures to Chinese cosmologies of mind-body holism. As a kind of reparative theory, wei dao privileges everyday and embodied epistemologies. But what can be said of Gong's wei dao, and how is it felt and sensed through the screen? To understand Gong's rapid rise to global stardom in the late 80s and 90s, we need to first make sense and senses of the politico-affective cultures that preceded her. In early philosophical musings, Mao Zedong wrote, quote, "Good medicine is bitter to the taste, but beneficial for the sickness," an idea that became widely implemented in political theater. Throughout the 50s, the Communist Party institutionalized a practice known as speaking bitterness, intended to accomplish several goals, including to awaken political consciousness in the peasant class, redress uneven land distribution and exploitation, and increase conscriptions to the People's Liberation Army. Educated party outsiders sought out impoverished peasants to publicly denounce their landlords, setting off a discursive chain reaction known as inducing bitterness with bitterness. Peasants were invited to, quote, "pour bitter water, dig poor roots, and speak bitterness" by pointing to the objects which landlords took from them during meetings. As ideological storytelling, speaking bitterness theatricalized personal grievance in order to strengthen class hatred and public anger. During the Cultural Revolution, bitterness operated widely as symbolic capital with which to publicly denounce and humiliate counter-revolutionaries. The more bitter one was or seemed, the more one had been wronged. I contend that speaking bitterness helped to nationalize consciousness, and that bitterness as an embodied orientation became part of an affective world-making through which resentment was emotionally engineered into Maoist society. Lingering into the post-Mao reform era, bitterness coincided with optimism and generated a cultural fever for new social ideologies. Within this permissive milieu, bitterness about the nation's tumultuous 20th century became dramatized in cultural production, including in backwards-gazing scar literature and the fifth-generation films credited for internationalizing Chinese cinema. Repeatedly cast in the roles of suffering women throughout such films, Gong became the face of this filmic movement, inspiring scholars like Ray Chow to observe that, quote, women's stories are a means for putting on display both the glorious and barbarous aspects of Chinese culture. Generating a cinematic catalog of bitter deaths by murder, suicide, or slow insanity in many of these films, Gong corporealized the nation's suffering. Rather than speaking bitterness, however, she embodies it. Her character in Red Sorghum, for instance, refuses to speak for the first 25 minutes of the film. Playing a sorghum distillery boss, Gong leads a band of men to produce the finest wine in the region and eventually to fight against the Japanese Imperial Army, a struggle that leaves only her lover and son alive. The first of Jong's Red Trilogy, each of which stars Gong, Red Sorghum reproduces embittered suffering through its narrative and mise en scène, particularly through its free-floating significations of the color red, decoupled from former Maoist associations. As Jong stated, he used the color to, quote, arouse sensory excitement and encourage unrestrained lust for life. Engaging in chromatic worlding, the film's red and vermilion flushes of lust and passion collide with images of blood and pain, generating affective and sensual confusion. Meanwhile, bitterness, which happens to be the Chinese cosmological taste correlate of the color red, constitutes the film's dominant structure of feeling. In contrast with the erotic implications of eating Murasaki's body, Red Sorghum's tasty bodies leak bitter fluids for an imagined Chinese futurity. For instance, Joer's lover's urine enhances the taste of wine for their proto-capitalist business. Joer bleeds to death during a surprise attack on the Japanese, and her son's salty tears by the film's end visualize the posterity of inherited trauma. Meanwhile, gestures to cannibalism become the site of absolute cruelty, moral disgust, and allegorical imperialism, as the Japanese order a butcher to flay his associate while alive in front of the village. The film's own body cannot even stomach this brutality and instead cuts away to a wide-angle disbelief.
据我老家的人说，我罗汉爷爷是当了共产党。
Red Sorghum's vivid tones and bitter odors of blood, wine, piss, tears, and flayed skin powerfully persist in the film's aftertaste, lingering in the body's sense memory. While Chinese intelligentsia found the film to be distastefully vulgar, it was precisely the film's coarseness that appealed to middle-brow appetites. Red Sorghum became the first art house box office success in China, and Gong became China's first post-Mao film star. Throughout the 80s and 90s, Gong's flavorful performances animated bitterness, envisioning a new feeling China and the birth of a new era of wounded, bleeding nationalism. Moreover, Gong centralized Chinese pain and bitterness for worldwide consumption, demonstrating the transnational mobility of indigestible flavors and bitter sweetness of Chinese femininity. Therefore, while a contemporary Western film like Hannibal Rising uses Gong to spice up the dull dish that is mainstream white culture, such fantasies of her deliciously indigestible body, in fact, deodorizes Gong's embittered Wei Dao, a flavor born from making sense and sensation of political suffering. So, in closing, Chinese medicine dictates that when one cannot taste, one cannot feel. Moreover, in such a context, a craving for bitterness is read as an ailment of the heart and of emotion itself. Returning to Western contexts wherein bitterness is often attached to undesire, I conclude by advocating for the utility of this flavor aesthetic. In the wake of 1960s revolutions, third cinema filmmakers created what they called indigestible films to the system. Can a dyspeptic cinema unmake appetites for the other? And here I'm thinking of Juana Rodriguez's provocation that, quote, feminism should be mouth-burning stuff, full of smoldering flavors, not easily forgotten. Engaging with some of these questions as a filmmaker, which I'll just briefly allude to with some stills from my film, I wonder if we could challenge the circumscribed tastes for other female bodies by mobilizing an aesthetics of bitterness and indigestion. Thank you.
Since we don't have an enormous amount of time, I'm not going to try and frame or respond. I just wanted to note the way in which this panel has, in really wonderful ways, taken the notion of the haptics of race into a different direction that I think is really productive, which is to think about the hapticality of racial intimacy. I think that the proximity that each one of you is trying to theorize is really useful in terms of what is the threat of racial intimacy, of bodily intimacy, or even in your case, about the suggestion, Risvana, of intimacy that cannot happen, right? And so in that way, each of you touched on the intersensory ways in which that intimacy has to be negotiated. Not necessarily through the visual, even though that's the starting point, but also through the sonic, through the gustatory, through the hapticality of vibration. And I have to say I was just really stunned and amazed by the way in which you're speaking to each other. So given that, I want to open it up to questions right away, because there's so much to talk about. Do we have questions or comments or responses?
Hi, thank you for your time and for the wonderful presentations. And forgive me, I really hope that you use your haptic perception to take a moment to reach into where this question comes from within me, or this predicament. You know, one of the things I was hoping to get from coming to this is an understanding of what black and white was that was a bit further than the common sense understanding. And that's something I felt I didn't get yet. And I was wondering if you could provide that now.
So I'll start off with one way of responding, which is that one of the things that was significant to me about the way in which that each of the presentations was addressing itself to racial formation, right? Rather than necessarily blackness or whiteness. It is, what are the circumstances under which blackness, whiteness, Chineseness, race comes to mean, and comes to mean the things that it does. So the slipperiness that you're referring to, I think is very intentional. It's really about thinking about the things that we take for granted as blackness or whiteness or Asianness, right? The way in which those things are constituted in a social setting and a historical setting. So part of me is resistant to trying to make something more concrete that in fact is so slippery, and intentionally so, to the extent that it can capture and racialize all sorts of different people in different ways and different moments towards specific political ends. So that's one way of framing the question, and I just want to ask if anyone wants to add.
Thank you all. Just a quick question about exploring the cannibalistic endeavor. I'm really curious about the intersensory as it sort of connects with cannibalism, but also cannibalizing, and I think that could even relate to other racialized experiences of being made and made into.
Yeah, well, I think I take a lot of inspiration from Bell Hooks' Eating the Other, in which she equates cultural appropriation to cannibalism. And also, just to tie it back in with smelling as well, there's something quite abject about smelling. That is, it dissolves subject-object positions, and cannibalism does the same kind of thing. It's both seductive, but it also, in the Kristeva sense, is threatening to identity. So I think that cannibalism keeps reappearing in these imaginaries, and Hannibal and our sort of fixation on Hannibal Lecter, even though he appears for 20 minutes in Silence of the Lambs, but it's the main character you think about, has something to do with the idea of ingesting the other, however that's being conceived. And I think it's a really useful paradigm to think about things like cultural appropriation and the structures of fascination and seduction in those types of encounter.
Hi, this comment is for Rizvana. Your presentation was lovely. I've been thinking a lot, just because I'm working on a project by the name of Suge Avery's Kiss. And it made me think a lot about the significance of the kiss as it blanketed and shaped that visual presentation within the film. You could see the residue of that kiss, how it manifested through the characterization of Celie's progress or whatnot. And I think your presentation really pushed forward. I don't know, I'm getting kind of blank here. But basically what I felt from the presentation was that what made me want to push back and go and look, I guess, further into those films to see how those moments, those gestures, those misconnections, or like those purposeful switches away from kisses, which are in tons of films as well, kind of affected my thinking about race at that time when I was seeing those films, because those were the first films that I saw, because those were what would be played on TV. And I just wanted to say I thank you for that.
Oh, yeah. Was it her question? To be honest. Okay, all right, that's cool. I mean, yeah, I'll just not say anything then.
Yes, I don't know if this is a question either. Perhaps more a comment. And so this is more for, I don't know how to pronounce your name, Ashon?
Ashon.
Ashon, okay. So nice to meet you. And yeah, your way of addressing these letters really moved thought somewhere, and in a way it not even moved it somewhere, but it moved with what was already moving. And so that's the trembling that you're talking there about, this attraction to that other, right? Like that love. That attraction. So I was really appealed by what you were saying, and so I was thinking two things. So the first one is how the letters, in a way, carry this character that doesn't feel real. It's almost as if you're talking to thin air, or you're talking to someone in between real and something that you invent and keep inventing, which in a way it's also not someone but a multiplicity, like it's as some many. So I really thank you for those multiple environments that were not one person. Who are you talking to, right? Like, so then
I can tell you some names if you want names.
Yeah. And, for sure, because then on the other side, there's of course a real person. So that's the stretchiness that was really, I appreciated a lot. And then the second thing is that I was thinking about this attraction, and I had to write it, otherwise it was going to leave my mind. So it's something that says, something of one is already in another. And one is not, as you say, categorical, fixed, closed entity, but yes, vibration and movement. Yes, it does make sense. What does not make sense is that we still have to ask the question if it makes sense. So that's what I wanted to say. So I was like, yes, 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 every sentence you were saying. So thank you.
I mean, thank you. So, like, 2010 is a real thing. I drove from Durham to Halifax, Nova Scotia. Very far drive, y'all. And when I was driving back from Halifax, I decided to stop in Boston. Is this being recorded? Oh, gosh. I stopped at a place to see some family, and when I was seeing family, I met somebody, thought that was going to be the one. I thought it was, I thought we were doing it. And so in a very real sense, it's about that real person at that time. And so, and then the letters emerge around certain kinds of people. So it's in some ways it's very concrete, but it is also a multiplicity. It's also me trying to think about the very concept of love, me trying to think about the concept of togetherness, me trying to think about what it means to inhabit the world alone. I wrote this thing, put it on my blog about Kim Burrell, who's this gospel singer, she's kind of homophobic, said some terrible things, but in the thing that I wrote, I talked about I'm 36, I'll be 37 in May, and been single, so sort of my entire life. And so I talk about loneliness and aloneness and what it means to inhabit the space of loneliness and aloneness as an individual who doesn't want to be lonely or alone. And so in some ways, I'm really trying to figure out for myself, especially when the sort of life that we've been called to as supposed scholars and academics and people that are supposedly thinkers, that a lot of what we're supposed to do is force solitude. Like, we're supposed to think alone. We're supposed to go to the library and be in our carols and in our offices. And this is the great thought that I came up with by myself. And me really wanting to reject the grounds of what we think thinking is. And so really trying to think about how does one think with another, and how is that always an erotic encounter? How is that always an encounter for friendship? How is that always a desire for being in relation, being entangled with another? And so I'm speaking, or not Ashon, but the character, is speaking very specifically about concrete experiences of inhabiting the world in ways that seem to go against the way our flesh is built, or matter is sort of constructed, that matter is always vibrating, and so why do we try to resist our own vibration? And so yes, I'm speaking very singularly about my specific experiences, but I'm also actually trying to use that not as like an egotistical project, because then it's just boring and who cares? I don't care enough. But I really want to think about the ways that we inhabit the world, and how can the ways that we inhabit the world inform justice, inform concepts of love and togetherness and sociality as resistance to like white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. And that's really what this Lonely Letters project is trying to do. That's why it couldn't be about the person from 2010, because if it was about that person, I would have stopped writing after that literal third email where it was just like, oh, you don't respond? Okay, cool. But there was something, it seems, that was compelling me to still write and to still think and to still explore, and I'm still actually doing it. So thank you for that set of provocations and questions.
I just want to add something to bring you in conversation with Samantha, which is that your emphasis on vibration, actually both of your emphasis on vibration, is sort of the ultimate haptic engagement, right? Because it's really about the contact with that sound, or the physical manifestation of the sound. And so when Samantha, when you were showing the clip of Overtime, one of the things I kept thinking about was everything you had just said about vibration, because the voice in that, the overlay, is a hum, right? Which is literally vibration that isn't externalized in the same way. But the other thing I thought about is that it's a chorus. And the choral voices configure in a way that, to me, and tell me if I'm wrong, that was a work song. And so what does that mean, right? To actually overlay this as a work song. What does that do historically about the visual rendering of the noose and the sporting black body? And how does that relate to being with other people, being in relation to?
Thank you, Tina, for that generous question. I think what you picked up on are all these correct bits about the film. I was talking to Hank about the soundscape particularly, and he wanted a really haunting oral experience, that it is a hum, it is a chant, it is a lot of breath. At times it's the beat of the ball, and it's about the encounter of these histories, but also thinking about them in terms of labor, that when we see athletic bodies, we are seeing not just entertainment or dramatic spectacle or see or change visual art, you're seeing work, you're seeing bodies put to work, and I think that's sort of an important sort of part of the piece is the use of the individual going towards the noose, but also the team play, the interaction of the bodies. That's when the sort of feeling is the hum and the chant becomes what I would say is sort of a hearing of sweatiness. Like if you feel like you could hear sweat, that's what it feels like, the flap of bodies. We begin to feel in our own selves the way our bodies would hit up and brush up against each other, which of course harkens back to this idea of the chain gang, right? To the ideas of black bodies as spectacles, as spectacular achievements, as working together for various institutional means. And it's one of the things that I think is so great and moving about the piece is you hear it before you see it, and then it's sort of the last thing as the ball plays out. I will say one other thing. I asked Hank, did he recognize that he kind of was playing off of the Nike freestyle commercials from 2001, and where they use African Bambadas, sort of they're trying to recreate the beat. I can't remember, I think it's Planet Rock, of his song using just the ball and thinking about the body and the ball as connective, as sound, as percussion. Is something that I think is really interesting. So thank you.
And I just want to add one more, which is, because all these connections kept coming out in my mind, of the question of breath and the kiss. So, I mean, when you first pointed out that they never kiss, I was kind of astonished. But do they have to, right? So what about the intimacy of the exchange of breath that does not ever become physical contact? Right? It's the sharing of breath that's the violation of intimacy, right? So I was just wondering what you were thinking about the sort of limits that you're pushing in terms of the requirement to kiss or not to kiss. Where does that take us?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are there are a lot of things I was trying to do in a very short amount of time. One, I think, is to really interrogate the first thing is to interrogate the ontology of the kiss. Tiona, I'm not sure what you were asking, but for me, right, I really liked that you said you could feel the residue of a kiss that never really happens on screen. And like, what's interesting about that A.O. Scott New York Times essay or article is that he asked the question, is a kiss just a kiss? Or no, he says, a kiss is just a kiss, and that's just for me wrong. A kiss is never just a kiss. It's weighted and burdened with so much history, right? And that's why I started with that Morrison, because I think she's invested in, right, like a kiss that isn't a kiss, but also a kiss that links up with the past, with what Christina Sharp calls weather, as right, kind of, the blanket feeling of anti-blackness. And I mean, with respect to breath, I guess what I was trying to map in the film is the way in which Dorothy Dandridge's kind of frenzied embrace with this white man, like, really takes on all of the displacements of, right, the other intimacies that are suggested on screen but never happen. So all of that gets displaced onto this kind of frenzied embrace between her and this white man, which is really interesting for a variety of reasons. And it's interesting to me because I think it's just odd to me that people refer to Dandridge as this like figure that is allowed to tease white audiences but not allowed to touch them, which is shocking to me because she becomes, like I said, this kind of receptacle for, like, you know, segregationist fantasies and integrationist desires. But I don't know, I mean, I think with respect to breath, I don't know what to say. I don't know if you can help me out, but.
Breath is a fact, I don't know. Breath is a thing. But like, I mean, I would be like, sure, it's nice to have an embrace without the kiss, but you actually want the kiss, right? Like, you know, is it in his something? Oh no, that's not the way. Y'all know that song. If you want to know if you love him so, it's in his kiss. The song doesn't say if you want to know if he loves you so, it's in his breath. Even though the breath and kissing are linked in a very strong sense. You are exchanging breath when you do kiss, but like, there's something about the contact, the actual contact that moves beyond the breath that seems to be important, that seems to mark a certain kind of intentionality of relation that perhaps because we all share in the breathing of air, that exchanging breath doesn't seem to be as intentional as what the kiss actually does, even though they are rehearsing similar kinds of performative processes. And it, you know, I think that A was actually looking for a kiss from this person, and they did eventually do so. And so I think that there's something that is generative about the contact that moves beyond the breath, even though the breath is what makes that contact possible. So.
Yeah, it's what you talk about, it's the sense experience beyond sensuality.
Yeah.
That I think resonates.
Can I just say something? Okay, I mean, I think like just, yeah, to kind of echo and follow through on what you're saying, I think what's really interesting to me is, you know, what exists beyond kind of immediately recognizable sensuous experience. And I'm interested in thinking about the kiss as frenzy, as a kind of madness, as a kind of, you know, like a thing that is irreducibly sensual. And what I was also thinking about, you know, when you were reading is, and I think the question from over there kind of helped me think about this, but the relationship between the letter and breath, right? And breathing out, and what is the relationship between the letter and breath, but then also the letter and the kiss, right? The letter, like your letters are kind of kisses, right? Without end.
They're petitions. So someone asked me yesterday, I presented part of this yesterday, and someone asked me about the relationship between like the letter and prayer. And for me, what he's also, what A is also doing is, in the way that Black Pentecostal prayers are typically collective, and there's like, it's a lot about petitioning God, asking God for something, that what A is really trying to do in this series of letters is to petition Moth in order to, it's like, it's a prayer to Moth, and it's a prayer about Moth, and it's a prayer about their relationship and the sustenance. And so in that way, the letter is about the breathing out, or the breathing out of petition, the breathing out of desire in order to establish and maintain a certain kind of relation with this figure. And so it is about the recognition of the fact that they share breath in the world, or share air in the world, and that he wants to breathe in a way that is consistent with the way Moth breathes. He wants to be with Moth in this very sort of intimate and deep way. And so the letter is actually just the performative utterance of the desire for shared breath, perhaps.
And might we say that that's also with something that links, I think, all four of us, is this idea of expression, right? So, and as you were talking about bitterness, right, that has to be expressed, it has to be expelled. And the kiss makes me think of the pathway to the kiss, the expression, the way, as well as the expression in the representations of Black sporting bodies, how to express effort in certain kinds of ways. I don't know if you wanted to say anything. But you don't have to.
I think that's, yeah, that's great.
It's okay. It's okay. Well, we're actually at the end of our time anyway, so please thank all of our panelists and